All right, we're going to keep this moving because we know that our hikers actually have a long hike to get to, believe it or not. But we do have another special speaker today that I wanted to take a moment to introduce. This is a man, it's an interesting week actually, to be having these guys kick off on the hike with all of the news around the Paris climate deal this week. And I want to introduce to you next a man who has actually been intimately involved in helping to craft that and really advocate for the environment and the climate so much in this way. So I'd like to introduce Professor Timmons Roberts, who is the Ittleson Professor of Environmental Studies and Senior Fellow with the Brookings Institute. Professor Timmons.
Thanks, Jason. I think he just said that I need to be very brief, didn't he? So indeed, to let these guys do how many miles today? 34? 34 today. That's exciting. And what a great morning. So I'm a professor at Brown University. I bring students to the UN climate negotiations every year. I've been going about 15 years myself, and it's been about 7 years. I bring about a dozen students each year. And we work especially with the least developed countries, the poorest countries in the world, to try to help them have a little more capacity in this struggle to try to deal with this problem of climate change. So I have 3 points. 1, climate change is real. Number 2, the Paris Agreement is needed and the federal government is not doing enough, so we have to take care of this locally. And then 3, that Burrillville is a great example of what we don't need and what we need to stop if we're going to really deal with this issue. So how does that sound? I'll be really quick. Number 1, climate change is real. They've been measuring it at Mount, what's it called? Oh shoot. No, in Hawaii.
Thermometer?
Mauna Loa, yeah, it's in Mauna Loa. They have an observatory at the top, right, where they collect. They've been collecting since the 50s the air samples, and the amount of carbon dioxide has risen from what's now known to be pre-industrial levels of 280 parts per million. Now it's up to 405, and it's rising faster each year. So, and the physics is very simple. It's like putting an extra blanket on a bed, that you're holding in more of the heat, the more we put up there. And everything we put up there is going to stay there about 100 years. So in Rhode Island, we're already seeing the impacts of that carbon dioxide. Namely, sea level has risen about 9 inches at the Newport tide gauge since the 1930s, and it's rising faster each year than it used to. So it's sort of inflecting upwards. And this is really a problem for Rhode Island since we're so vulnerable with our coastal properties, as Senator Governor Chafee said a minute ago. It's also, we did a little analysis where we just looked at the number of days over 80 degrees at the T.F. Green Airport. And that's gone up by almost 2.5 weeks since I was a kid in the 1960s. So each summer now has 2.5 weeks more of these days over 80. And that's important for human health because that's the point at which more people start showing up at the emergency room with asthma and acute, cardiorespiratory problems. So that's dangerous. It's like dangerous heat waves are getting longer and more frequent than they used to be when we were kids, those of us who are getting old. So climate change is real. Number 2, the Paris Agreement, right, is a voluntary global agreement where countries got to come in with their own pledges. And the U.S. came in with a pledge which was, it had some ambition, but on the other hand, it was not adequate. So the Paris Agreement is voluntary. So a lot of what was said by the president, unfortunately, on Thursday was just not true, saying that this was being imposed on us by some external force, that we were giving up our sovereignty to other countries, really was just false. It's a voluntary agreement, and it's also inadequate. That is, it so far has reduced the amount of expected warming, but not by enough, not nearly enough to keep us safe in Rhode Island, and especially these poor countries in sub-Saharan Africa and these small island states that literally, this would be the highest point in some of these islands out in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. So it's voluntary, it's inadequate, but it's a start, right? So the Paris Agreement is at least universal. That is, we've had 152 countries have come in with these pledges, including the big polluters like the United States, Europe, China, India. They've actually, both China and India are doing more than we expected. China has peaked its emissions 3 or 4 years in a row now, much earlier than they pledged. They pledged to do so by 2030. So when he said, oh, they don't have to do anything until 2030, well, they've already done what they said they were going to do, And now they're switching to renewables because they see that it's a great future for their industries, and it should be for ours too. In Rhode Island, one of the studies said that we could have 100% renewables in the state if we had 62% of our energy coming from offshore wind. So if you look out there and see the turbines off of Block Island, that's the future really for Rhode Island's energy. We can do that. We don't need the Burrillville power plant. So that gets me to item number 3, and that is, even with our current levels of energy, the grid, the ISO in New England, the electrical grid, isn't buying. They don't want the Burrillville power that's expected. They're buying less than half of the power that's expected to come from this power plant. And if we actually do some of this switching to renewables, and we actually do the basic things of waste, cutting down the waste, improving our efficiency as a state, which saves us billions of dollars. Right now we spend almost $4 billion a year in Rhode Island on fossil fuels, which are all produced somewhere else. So all that money just pours out of our state economy. So the more that we can produce here with solar and wind and with energy efficiency, saving our money, that money stays in our economy. That's creating jobs at home. And there's, for example, our carbon pricing bill, the Energize Rhode Island Act, which we did a fiscal study that showed that it would create about 4,000 net jobs in the state because it'd be keeping those $4 billion a year in our state economy instead of sending it to these places that produce fracked natural gas that would power the Burrillville power plant. So the Burrillville power plant is bad globally because it's part of this problem. I mean, it would lock us in for 30 or 40 or 50 more years of burning natural gas, which maybe was a bridge fuel 10 or 20 years ago to get us off of coal, right? The Brayton Point coal-fired power plant over in Fall River, Massachusetts just closed 2 days ago, apparently forever. That's a big moment. I mean, that's basically the end of coal in New England. And so that was important, and natural gas helped with doing that. But the next bridge, I mean, we've been going back over the old bridge if we put in more natural gas. So we need to go forward to renewables, not backwards to natural gas. So Burrillville is not needed. Globally, it will make it impossible for us to meet the goals that are in the Resilient Rhode Island Act that Governor Chafee championed as governor in the last year of his term. A big achievement was that act, and Burrillville will make it impossible for us to meet that. And then there's all these negative impacts on the town of Burrillville, which are really important. So I want to say, as a sociologist, these local struggles against fossil fuel infrastructure are extremely important. And the more you can fight against these individual facilities of expanding pipelines and building new power plants or liquefied natural gas storage tanks and so on, that is making a statement that's going to make it more and more difficult for them to install this infrastructure, and that's really how we're going to win this battle on climate change, is one Burrillville power plant at a time. So thank you very much, and good luck to you guys. Really wish I was gone.